What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Turns out Mary Queen of Scots' son burned witches and had the Bible rewritten. The religious violence of the Protestant Reformation and legacy of political strife between Queen Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, loomed over the reign of King James I. Both issues influenced him to keep a firm hold on the political, but fear the supernatural. James was born in 1566, during an ongoing conflict between Scotland and England. He was the only son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. When he was 1 year old, he ascended the Scottish throne as King James VI, after his mother abdicated her position, and was crowned King James I of England after the passing of his cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, in 1603. During James's reign, witch hunts, trials and executions swept through the British Isles, and he remained fixated on their religious and spiritual consequences. Whether it was by commissioning a new English-language translation of the Bible in 1604 or obsessing over alleged cases of witchcraft, James believed himself to be an instrument of divine authority and justice. Ultimately, he unified the warring kingdoms of Scotland and England, but it was a long, arduous path to peace. James began the most notorious witch hunt in Scottish history. The North Berwick trials of 1590 marks one of the first and largest witch hunts in Scottish history, and James played a significant role in them. After he married Princess Anne of Denmark, they set sail for Scotland, but were met with a series of storms that nearly put an end to the young couple and delayed their arrival. The ordeal was so traumatic that James suspected foul play. He felt the only reasonable explanation was someone, or a group of people, had tried to sabotage his marriage and target his life. In response, James initiated a witch hunt that rapidly expanded as the accused made confessions and further allegations under torture. In total, at least 70 people were accused of witchcraft, and most were sentenced to death. James's witch trials disproportionately targeted women. Early modern Europe's witch hysteria predominantly victimized women. According to historian Susanna Lipscomb, between 70 and 80% of the accusations made during this time period targeted women. James believed women were naturally more likely to be witches, since they were frilier than men, making them easier to be entrapped in these gross snares of the devil. Though both men and women stood trial for witchcraft in North Berwick, far more of the accused were women. Scholar Deborah Willis has even theorized James primarily targeted women in the North Berwick witch trials to rid himself of an overbearing, malevolent female gaze, left by Queen Elizabeth and his mother, thus reasserting his own masculine power. James passed a harsh act against witchcraft. James considered witchcraft a serious crime, and he engineered punishments he believed matched the severity of the offense. In 1604, only a year into his reign in England, he passed a new Witchcraft Act. Though other witchcraft laws had already been enacted by Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, James's act took a hardline approach. Convicted witches were hanged regardless of whether the accused had allegedly caused bodily harm to others. Despite the severity of James's punishments, his act also wrought an unintentionally mild effect on the witchcraft trials. Because it put an end to torture as a means of extracting confessions, fewer people faced conviction. He saw himself as a Christian crusader against evil forces. Photo: John de Critz, Wikimedia Commons, public domain. He saw himself as a Christian crusader against evil forces. During the North Berwick trials of 1590, James believed he had been a target of magical mischief. Accused witches testified the devil hated James because the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world. Testimonies like this were political gifts for James. According to author Donald Tyson, he used them to position himself as an avenging knight of the Christian faith. James claimed divine authority in his crusade against the dark magic Satan had allegedly unleashed throughout his kingdom. He circulated propaganda that stoked fears about witches. James wanted to get the word out about the dangers of witchcraft in the wake of the North Berwick trials. In 1591, he sponsored the publication of News from Scotland, a pamphlet that further sensationalized reports about the trials, stoking fear and paranoia about witches. This helped James position himself as a defender of divine law and order within his realms. He wrote a book on dangerous witches. The North Berwick witch trial stirred James's imagination and convinced him witches were a clear and present danger. He was influenced by the events to write a book about dealing with witches and witchcraft. The text thoroughly identified different kinds of supernatural activities and occurrences. Demonology was first published in Scotland in 1597, then in England 6 years later. He was noted for his ability to uncover false witch accusations. James involved himself in witchcraft trials because of his fascination with the supernatural and his self-affirmed role as guardian against the occult. In this position he was said to be able to uncover, by his own skill, notorious impostures. One of the highest-profile cases involved in Gunter, a woman who claimed to be possessed by demons in the early 1600s. James became interested in the case after Gunter made allegations against people she claimed had bewitched her, and he met with her to get the full story. During their conversation, James compelled the woman to confess it was a hoax. It was a ruse hatched between Anne and her father to exact revenge on people they believed had wronged them. His family's violent past may have contributed to his fascination with the dark arts. There was no shortage of darkness in the life of young King James, and it might have inspired his fascination with witchcraft. When James ascended to the throne at just 13 months, his mother had been ousted. Not long after, his father died in an explosion. By the time of the North Berwick witch trials, Mary Queen of Scots had been executed by Queen Elizabeth I of England. Commissioning a new translation of the Bible was a political act. Religion and politics were inseparable in early modern Europe. In England, the Crown was head of the Anglican Church. Moreover, ministers and rebels sometimes used biblical passages to question the authority of kings and queens. Since there were many unofficial English translations of the Bible, they weren't all the same. The Geneva Bible, for example, was politically subversive since it included annotations and marginalia that criticized royalty. By commissioning a new Bible, James hoped that he could justify his monarchical authority in the religious text by standardizing the language and making it free from subversive commentary. Furthermore, James hoped the newly translated text would become the single Bible to unify different schools of Protestantism in England and Scotland and strengthen his political legitimacy. He assembled a committee to translate the Bible. Contrary to what the name may suggest, the King James Bible was not created solely by King James. Rather, James brought together a diverse group of language scholars to create the new translation. The translators, however, did not have the final word. After they created a suitable version, committees made up of religious and royal officials had to approve it, and final approval was granted by the monarch himself. It took 7 years to create the new translation. He began efforts to unify Scotland and England. James's reign may have divided subjects by labels like Catholic, Protestant, witch, and sorcerer, but his greatest legacy was unity. He brought together the Scottish and English monarchies by ascending to both thrones in relatively quick succession. Even prior to the Scottish Wars of Independence in the 13th and 14th centuries, England and Scotland were completely separate countries with their own monarchies, churches, and systems of law and education. Moreover, the two kingdoms shared a history marked by warfare. James also had a strong claim to the English throne due to the royal ancestry of his mother and father, even though he became King James VI of Scotland in 1567. When Queen Elizabeth I of England passed on in 1603, she named her cousin James as her heir. The union of the crowns was a major step towards political unification. Contrary to his mother's wishes, he was raised a Protestant. James was born a king in a world heavily divided between Catholics and Protestants. His mother was an avowed Catholic, and when James was an infant, she wanted him to become one too. She gave baby James a Catholic baptism, proclaiming her intention to continue a tradition of Catholic monarchs ruling over Protestant Scotland. But when Mary abdicated in 1567, she gave up her right to raise her son. James was subsequently raised by his tutor George Buchanan as a Protestant, and was encouraged to despise his mother and her religion. His obsession with witches likely inspired William Shakespeare's Macbeth. James's interest in witchcraft was well known throughout his two kingdoms, to the point that it likely inspired William Shakespeare's Macbeth. The representations of witches in the play conforms to James's descriptions from demonology. James's supposition that supernatural storms delayed his wife's arrival in Scotland, and nearly cost him his life, correlate to Shakespeare's portrayal of witches brewing up storms. Additionally, Shakespeare probably wrote Macbeth as a short play because he knew James didn't have the patience to sit through a long performance. Turns out, Mary Queen of Scots' son, King James VI of Scotland and I of England, not only burned witches but also rewrote the Bible, actions that seem contradictory at first glance yet are deeply entwined with the religious, political, and psychological forces that shaped his reign. James was born in 1566 into dynastic strife, religious reform, and political violence. From the moment he was born, he was surrounded by instability. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a devout Catholic and one of the most controversial monarchs of her time, locked in an ongoing struggle against Protestant reformers in Scotland and entangled in a bitter rivalry with her Protestant cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. After Mary's forced abdication in 1567 and eventual execution by Elizabeth in 1587, James, still a child, was crowned King James VI of Scotland and raised under a Protestant regency. This formative period, marked by betrayal, political manipulation, and religious dogma, profoundly influenced the boy king, seeding in him a lifelong obsession with power, legitimacy, and divine order. Obsessions that would later manifest in his infamous witch hunts and his landmark commissioning of the King James Bible. By the time James assumed the English crown in 1603 following Elizabeth I's death, he was already a seasoned monarch with decades of experience navigating the complex religious and political terrain of Scotland. But it was during his rule over the newly unified kingdoms that his fascination with the supernatural and religious authority reached its peak. James's direct involvement in witch hunts, especially the North Berwick witch trials of 1590, earned him a lasting reputation as one of the most notorious witch hunters in British history. The trials were sparked by a deeply personal event: the violent storms that battered his ship during his return voyage from Denmark after marrying Princess Anne. Rather than attributing the storms to natural causes, James saw a conspiracy of witches at work, an interpretation that reflected both his paranoid worldview and the widespread belief in supernatural evil at the time. Fueled by his fear and righteous anger, James authorized a brutal campaign of torture and execution, in which at least 70 people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft, forced to confess, and often sentenced to death. This witch hunt was not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of persecution that unfolded across Scotland and England during his reign, often with James's explicit or tacit support. He believed himself to be a Christian monarch divinely appointed to purge his kingdom of satanic influence, and witch trials served both as a religious crusade and a political tool to consolidate power and assert moral authority. The misogyny that permeated early modern Europe was deeply embedded in James's witch-hunting policies. In his eyes, women were not only physically weaker but spiritually more susceptible to demonic influence. This belief was codified in both his writings and his legal reforms, most notably the 1604 Witchcraft Act, which he pushed through Parliament shortly after ascending the English throne. While previous monarchs had passed anti-witchcraft laws, James's version was harsher and more theological in tone, treating witchcraft as not merely a civil crime but a profound spiritual threat. Under this law, even those accused of using witchcraft without causing physical harm could be executed. Ironically, the act also contributed to a reduction in convictions over time because it limited the use of torture, which had previously been used to extract confessions. Still, James's actions reflected his unwavering belief that he was locked in a spiritual battle against the forces of darkness, and he saw no contradiction between wielding the sword of justice against witches and promoting biblical piety. This same sense of divine mission underpinned James's most enduring legacy: the commissioning of the King James Bible in 1604. As he sought to unify his new kingdom and stamp his authority on the religious life of England, James recognized the importance of a single, authoritative English translation of the Bible that would reflect both Protestant theology and royal supremacy. Previous English translations, such as the Geneva Bible, were popular but politically problematic, often featuring marginal notes that challenged the authority of monarchs. James found these annotations subversive and dangerous, and he believed that a new translation, stripped of political commentary and infused with regal grandeur, would reinforce both the spiritual unity and the divine legitimacy of his reign. In addition to being a literary triumph, the King James Version, which was completed in 1611 by a committee of 47 scholars, was a political tool designed to stabilize the kingdom under a unified religious text. Its soaring language and majestic tone mirrored James's vision of monarchy, a reflection of divine order on earth. Just as he believed himself to be a bulwark against witches and heresy, he saw the Bible as the sword of truth by which his subjects would be governed, instructed, and morally restrained. James's paranoia about witches, his obsession with the supernatural, and his fierce promotion of Christian orthodoxy all sprang from his unique background and turbulent early life. The trauma of his father's murder under mysterious circumstances, an explosion that many suspected was politically motivated, combined with the imprisonment and execution of his mother, left an indelible mark on the young king. Raised by Protestant lords who viewed his Catholic heritage with suspicion, James grew up in a court where loyalty was conditional and political intrigue was rampant. It's not surprising that he developed a worldview where invisible forces, whether spiritual or conspiratorial, were constantly at work behind the scenes. His 1597 treatise Demonology laid out his beliefs in detail, categorizing forms of witchcraft, demonic possession, and necromancy while arguing for the necessity of severe punishment. This text, part theological manual and part royal propaganda, offered intellectual justification for the witch hunts and established James as a scholar king who was uniquely capable of discerning the hidden truths of the supernatural world. He even claimed a special ability to detect false accusations, as in the famous case of Anne Gunter, whose supposed possession and claims of witchcraft were exposed as a fraud after James personally interrogated her. Moments like these served to reinforce his self-image as both a rational investigator and a divinely appointed protector of Christian order. Yet even as he condemned witches and demonized the Catholic threat, James was keenly aware of the power of image and narrative. He leveraged the media of his time, pamphlets, sermons, and public trials, to shape public opinion and stoke fears about witches. One of the most influential publications of this period was News from Scotland, a pamphlet that sensationalized the North Berwick trials and presented James as the heroic target of satanic plots. These publications helped transform the trials into national spectacles and cast James in the mold of a spiritual warrior. The witches weren't just criminals. They were enemies of the king and, by extension, of God. This fusion of royal identity with divine purpose allowed James to present his actions, whether burning witches or translating the Bible, not as expressions of tyranny or fear but as necessary steps to restore moral order in a world on the brink of chaos. Still, James's actions did not occur in a vacuum. His policies and beliefs were part of a broader European trend of witch hunts and religious conflict that engulfed the continent during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. From Germany to France, tens of thousands were executed for witchcraft during this period, and James was far from the only monarch who saw himself as a divine warrior. But his influence was unique in that he helped institutionalize these beliefs in English and Scottish law, and he left behind a cultural and literary legacy that extended well beyond his lifetime. The King James Bible would become the most widely read English-language book for centuries, shaping not only religious thought but also the English language itself. Meanwhile, his witch hunts, though eventually curtailed, would leave a legacy of fear, misogyny, and state-sponsored persecution that endured long after his death.